Welcome to The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky, a weekly podcast that breaks down politics, policy, and current affairs. I'm Michael Brodkorb. Becky Scher is still out on maternity leave, so you're flying solo with me this week, but I promise I've got a fantastic episode ahead. I'm joined today by two returning favorites, John Rouleau and Julius Hernandez. John is a seasoned Republican strategist and executive director of the Minnesota Jobs Coalition. Julius, a Democrat insider and director of advocacy for the Institute of Digital Humanity, brings the other side of the aisle and plenty of sharp insight to our discussion. Today we're diving into Original Sin, President Biden's decline, its cover-up, and his disastrous choice to run again, the explosive new book by Jake Tapper and Alex Thompson. The book offers a critical and compelling look at the final chapter of Joe Biden's presidency, drawing from more than 200 interviews. It details how Biden's inner circle, dubbed the Politburo, worked to conceal signs of his cognitive decline and blocked potential Democratic challengers, leading to a disastrous 2024 debate against Donald Trump and ultimately Biden's withdrawal from the race. We'll break down what the book reveals about political loyalty, political power structures, and the consequences of leadership decisions made behind closed doors. Thank you for joining us, and as always, we appreciate you choosing The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky. Let's get into it. I am excited to be here today with John Rouleau and Julius Hernandez, and we're doing something a bit different today on The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky. Again, trying to not break the podcast while Becky is gone. We hope she's doing well. We hope to have her back soon. But we're going to do a book review today because all three of us have recently read Original Sin, the new book by Jake Tapper and Alex Thompson it's all about Joe Biden, his decision to run for re-election and then drop out. It's the cover-up, the decline of him. And what this book is obviously is really just blowing up nationally. But I thought it would be interesting to get two people in Minnesota. This is a Minnesota-based podcast, and as much as we love to discuss national stuff, I wanted to get get the context, review, and thoughts from two people that I respect immensely that have been on this podcast. Both John and Julius have been on sometimes together, and to go through this book because I think each of our lenses in looking at this will be interesting to see. And so I think that this episode is going to be unique in a sense that we're talking about a book that's come out, but we'll see how it goes. I think it's going to go well. I think it's going to be an interesting conversation. I'm going to go alphabetically by last name. Julius, let's start with you. Give a minute or so, take your review of the book.
Yeah, I think I'll say this. I think me and John will probably agree a lot more on this podcast episode than we ever have on the other ones that we've been on together. But I think the book I don't know that it was groundbreaking in any way that we didn't already know there was stuff going on with Biden's cognitive health. Obviously, this is written by Jake Tapper and Alex Thompson, and I think they're incredible reporters and fairly good at their jobs of being non-biased when they do this. And I think this book really shows that I hate using the word cover-up, but this was a cover-up. Joe Biden was not fit to continue running for office. He was not fit to continue serving as president. And I don't know, there was obviously a few new pieces of information that we got in there outside of what the mainstream media was reporting before the election. But I think it's just really fascinating to see the scope of this situation in the book, where it wasn't necessarily even just that it was a cover-up. It was that everyone knew what was going on in politics, in national politics on the Democratic side, and no one stood up and said anything besides a few people. And I think that's really, the book really talks about why and how that happened. And I think that's the most fascinating part of this book entirely, is just how people were scared to stand up for something bigger. And yeah, I'm excited to talk about it. I really am. It's a great book, a very good book.
John, your take.
I think when we were talking about doing this, I got to the book a little bit ahead of you, and the way that I have summed it up is that it was somehow simultaneously more brutal than I expected, and yet less enlightening and less informative than I expected. And from that standpoint, I think it was an important book that needed to be written. I think that it's important that this gets put down into history, and I also was a little bit disappointed and let down with some of the decisions that the authors made, and I understand that their objective was to write a book, whether they needed to grant people anonymity. I understand that calculation when you're trying to get the story out. But a lot of, I think this has provided opportunity for a lot of people to do a CYA, start writing some revisionist history down. And not to take anything away from Alex Thompson, who is one of the people who was out there actually covering this prior to the debate. I think after the debate, the floodgates opened. Everyone had their permission structure to start writing about this. But frankly, a little bit of revisionist history from Jake Tapper on this, who pushed back, who mocked, who criticized Republicans who brought this up and was very dismissive of them. But also on the staff side, why are we granting anonymity to cabinet secretaries who knew what was going on and now want to save their honorariums and whatever fellowships they're going to get from some Ivy League institution or sitting on a board of a company? I think there needs to be a fuller accounting of it, but I think it was important to get this book out there. But yeah, less informative and enlightening than I had hoped, but still brutal to have it all written down in one place.
John, you did get the book ahead of me, and
no spoilers.
No spoilers. You did get the book ahead of me, and what I would just say is this: I was surprised at how just damning it was, and how much rich detail there was about how much of a cover-up this was. And as someone who is read a lot about Watergate and Nixon, I would say that this is the first scandal that I think is more serious than Watergate. I truly do. And we can talk about more, but it's because of the level of gaslighting and the level of coordination it took to pull this off. It was also, and Pollyannish of me, but I was surprised at how just cold and calculated the decisions were. And maybe that's naive of me, because all of us are in varying degrees are political animals in some way, and we've seen cutthroat politics. But this was at a new level. And what was, again, I agree with both of your guys' descriptions, but I think my takeaway was, boy, the number of times that the evidence was clear as to what was going on, and they continued to go down this road of, for lack of a better phrase, propping President Biden up when he clearly was not in a position to run for re-election, I think will have huge ramifications on a number of institutions. Number one, the media. And we'll talk about that a bit more. I think that they get dinged a lot in this, but also the cynicism that the public has towards politics and how manipulative it can be. And I think that's one of the issues that I think stuck with me, that there was just the level of orchestration and gaslighting that was being done was simply profound, was absolutely simply profound. John, we'll start with you, go back to you for a second. What stuck out the most from you from this book that you were, as you said, not a lot of surprises, but what stuck out with you the most to you in terms of maybe the lesson or the takeaway that going forward people can think about what was going on during this time?
And so I'll be really curious to hear what you guys say about this, because maybe it's because I'm a Republican, maybe it's because I'm a little bit more skeptical, whatever it is, but the decline of Joe Biden had been evident for quite some time, right? Even going back to 2019, 2020, and seeing where he was at. And I'd be curious your take on it as people who were opposed to President Trump, who, Julius, certainly you were a Biden guy in 2020. Michael, did you vote for Biden in 2020?
I did, yes.
I don't know if there was less grace given to me or given to him by myself, but this was apparent. It's something that I had been observing and tracking and saw in real time. And one of the things that I kept coming back to as I read this was, how didn't you people notice this, right? Was the takeaway. And I felt certainly the Democratic electeds and the elites, but also the media, right? Looking back at how many fact checks there were saying that Joe Biden is just fine, that these clips of him are fake, right? And now you can go back and you can read the actual story about that freeze up at the Clooney fundraiser in Los Angeles. PolitiFact wrote an entire article and said, oh no, that was just normal. He paused to wave to the audience. And so I think the gaslighting by the Democratic politicians and party operatives, that's one thing. And maybe I'm a little bit cynical, but to be more expected. the gaslighting by the media and the fact checkers and the arbiters of truth, as they would like to hold themselves out to be, I feel like we got gaslit by them.
Absolutely.
And going back and looking at those fact checks, looking at the way that they treated anybody who dared question this. It's one thing for Andrew Bates to go light himself on fire on Twitter and talk about how Joe Biden can run circles around him and all of these really embarrassing things. But the thing that I think was most surprising is that you started to get to a point where people are willing to talk about the real kind of Biden legacy. He had this public persona of Biden is a good guy, right? He means well. And you start to see what a real political animal he was, the self-interest. You get to see Biden Inc. You get to see the extent of which his family was really self-interested and motivated by their own aspirations. And I think that's going to be an interesting chapter written into the history books after 40 years of Biden convincing everybody that he was just this nice guy who meant and wasn't like other politicians.
Julius.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple things I disagree with, but generally I think the sentiment is correct, and I think I agree with that part. I will say, in 2020, I was not entirely super excited about Biden, but it just seemed like once, and I didn't even vote for him in the primaries here in Minnesota. But what I will say is, like, when you go back and look at videos of Joe Biden from the 2020 primary debates, and then you look at the 2024 debate, it's clear that there was something wrong, obviously. But even up until the end of 2022, it felt like there was a dramatic shift where it was ultimately like, okay, there's very clearly something going on. And I think that's just like the matter of the office and what it brings. And ultimately, Joe Biden is 82 years old. He was 80 years old in 2022. That just goes to show that job is house training that job is. But what I will say is, I've said this before on the podcast, but I just want to reiterate it. What John says, I think, about cover up from media is incredibly important. But I think what even is more important is the cover up from his staff. Like, you hear about this group of people in the book that are his inner circle. They're called the Politburo. And it's Mike Donnellan, Steve Ricchetti, Bruce Reed, Ron Klain, Anita Dunn, Jen O'Malley, Dillon, and then Hunter and Jill. And ultimately, those were the people that shielded Biden, not only from his own staff in the White House, but essentially everyone in American media and politics, and kept saying he's fine, but they wouldn't actually tell the truth to him about his poll numbers. They wouldn't tell the truth about his status to people. And I am a firm believer that those people should never, ever work in politics ever again, ever. Because what John said is true. It was a cover-up and hypocrisy at the highest levels. It's just gross to me that people were willing to get away with that, or willing to let Biden continue on in that state. And also, they lied to the media exponentially. I mean, these people would call Jake Tapper and Alex Thompson. Some of these people would call and had no reason to disbelieve them outside of what they saw on TV. And so if you're a staffer in the White House, especially a senior level, inner circle person, to lie at the level you did, whether you believe it or not, is just, it's gross. It's sickening. And it's also, again, just hypocritical to say Donald Trump is a threat to democracy and he was doing all these horrible things while in office, and then you are also doing these things that are hypocritical at every level in terms of transparency and fitness for office. Because Democrats were yelling up and down from 2016 to 2020, and I was one of them, that Trump was unfit for office because of the way he behaved. It's very clear from this book that Biden was also in that same position, and there's no way around it. I think ultimately what it comes down to is there was a very small group of people that lied to everyone, and the media, I think John is correct, had a large part to play in it. But I think the other question I had throughout the course of this book was, what are you supposed to do if they just keep lying? If you don't have access to the president, if the doctor that is in charge of the president's checkups and medical history is also saying he doesn't think that Biden has any issues cognitively. What else can you do outside of that to portray a story that the White House continues to push back on and push back against? So I think ultimately really who bears the most responsibility here is the Politburo. And I think they are they sicken me to my core. I think the media has a part to play in it, but I really blame the people who lied continuously to Americans and to the American media for the last 4 years. That's really where I think I place most of the blame after reading the book.
Let's dial down on that for a second. But first, I want to follow up on something that John said. I voted for Biden in 2020, and I've discussed this before on the podcast, that my votes are less robotic these days if I disagree with the Republican. I believe in the two-party system, and I think it's my job to, that's my position on voting, is if I can't vote for the Republican, I'll vote for the Democrat just because I believe in the two-party system. But as Becky and I discussed throughout, kind of leading up to the year before the election, so in 2023 and then into 2024, Becky and I discussed a lot that our perspective was that if this was an election, both candidates were elderly, both candidates were old. But if this was an election, Becky and I said that, and I'm not speaking for her, but I think the record is pretty clear and reflects that we said Donald Trump was a few years younger than Joe Biden, but that Donald Trump came across much younger than Biden did, and that there was a concern about his age, and there was clearly issues about his age. And we discussed on the podcast, and it was one of the reasons why I had decided that I was not going to vote for. I was likely going to write someone in. And we can talk about who I was going to write in later. I've disclosed it before, but it's someone key in this book that I was going to write in, because there clearly was a decline. And people could see it. And what frustrates me so much about the book is, number one, the level of gaslighting, the level of people going out there and saying, you're not seeing what we're all seeing. And we talked about that a lot on the podcast, Becky and I did. But I want to ask you both a question on something specific. What should the staff have done? And let me pivot this, let me tee this up a little bit for you. You're a staffer in the White House. You are aware of what you're seeing from the president, a cognitive decline, a little bit of a physical decline. He's clearly much more frail. What should they have done? What realistically could they have done, and what should they have done? Either one of you go first.
Yeah, I will say this too. One of the things, and this is tying into the larger question, is that his staff knew well in advance after he got elected that polling showed most Americans didn't think Joe Biden was up for the job age-wise. They just thought he was too old. And what I would say about staff is, first and foremost, your job and your oath is to the Constitution. It's not loyalty to a person. It's not loyalty to a certain politician. It's to the Constitution. And we have barriers in place to stop someone from serving if they are not able to continue in that capacity. What I would say about the staff in this, especially the senior level staff, because one of the things they talk about in the book is that, like, even his mid-level staff didn't see him for sometimes months at a time. So it's, if you're these 7 or 8 people that I listed in the Politburo, your job is not to Joe Biden. I understand the loyalty, but your job as a staffer is to find your person's weakness and see how you can help fill the gap. Filling the gap for Joe Biden's weakness, which was cognitive decline, is to say this is not okay, is to, like, forcefully come out and write an op-ed, quit your job over this situation. Tell the American people the truth. That's first and foremost. If you are not willing to tell the truth in your job as a staffer in the White House, especially of all places, you are not fit to serve in the White House. If we are going to hold Trump and Republicans to the standard of truth, then we also need to be the bearers of truth also. And his staff should have seen it early. They should have convinced him not to run. And also, the other part of the book that I find so fascinating is they never, based off of the reporting in this book, his staff never told him the truth about polls. Never. Their pollsters, their, like, campaign side was filtered through the eyes of Steve Ricchetti and Mike Donlin, who would go in and say, the polls say you can come back. They never said that. Those polls were grim before the debate, and they were very grim after. And every time they would go into a meeting with him, they would present the most positive version they possibly could. And so if you are actively lying not only to the American people, but to the person of the office that you are serving, that is disgusting. And so I think ultimately what they should have done is recalibrated. Where is my loyalty to? It's the Constitution. And ultimately Joe Biden could not serve in that role anymore after 2024. And they should have said that. And they should have come out publicly and said, I love this man. I'm loyal to him. But he cannot serve another 4 years in office. And that's ultimately what they should have done. And they should have told him the truth as well in that process.
John, is that realistic?
Yeah, realistic, I think it'd be a tough thing to do, right? But these people who were in that inner circle were not supposed to just be his staff. These are people who had been with him for 40 years. They were friends. They were close friends. In some cases, they were family. And when family gets to the point where you need to take the car keys away or needs to go to a home, that's a tough decision to have, but you have to have it. My rule has always been that staff's job is to stay out of the news. It's not about you, it's about the name on the door, the name on the desk, and that's who you're doing your work for. That being said, president is such a unique position, right? Where when we have serious concerns about somebody's ability to take that emergency phone call at 2 a.m, and you have one person who is truly the one who is making those decisions, I think the stakes rise a little bit. And there's certainly precedent for that having happened, right? And we saw it and agree or disagree on the credibility and the truthfulness of the people who did it. But there were certainly people within Trump's first administration that were out there writing anonymous op-eds, that were leaking to the press, that were out there telling their story. And so there's precedent there. And so I think the admission that the Democrats and the Biden administration are, in essence, making is that they had lower standards for themselves than the first Trump administration did. And so I think there's something that should have been done. The thing that I keep coming back to and that you hear throughout this book is that, and Julius mentioned it with the media, that what should they have done? They were being lied to, and the mid-level staff that didn't know because they didn't see. And the thing I come back to is that the American people saw this. The American people understood this. Certainly my proximity to President Biden is much lower than even a mid-level or entry-level staffer in Eisenhower office building.
That's a great point.
They are still there, and I could see this happening.
Yeah.
So could 70% of the American people. And so I frankly don't buy that excuse that what could we have done? We didn't see it coming, because the rest of us did, and we were nowhere near as close. And so that's just, in my mind, revisionist history. It's excuse making. It's people who are unwilling to hold themselves accountable or to look in the mirror at what their role was in it. But for most of the American people, they saw this coming.
Yeah. And if I think the other part of it too that like tracks with what you're saying is, I think there's two ways you could have looked at this. From the perspective of what we read in this book about the cover-up and the way that his family and his staff were keeping people away from what was really happening. You can frame it two ways. His family and his staff and his friends, like you said, and that was a good point, that a lot of these people are his friends first and foremost. They're people that should care about him in this way. What I think you should frame it as is two ways. Either these people knew that Biden could not serve in that role any longer and that he'd had serious cognitive decline, and they were committing elder abuse. Simple as that. Or they did not know, and that they were not convinced themselves that he had cognitive decline. But the job of the president is to convince people that you can do that job. And a part of that is messaging, it's communication. Biden's always been a gaffe machine, but not in this way, where he was losing his thoughts. And so as your staff, as a staff member and as a family member, you have to say, I don't think you can convince people you're capable of this job anymore. And I go back to, I don't like to give Republicans win, but I think John makes a good point that we held ourselves, that this administration held itself to a lower standard. That all across the book in other capacities too, not even just his health, but the way he interacted with his DOJ, for example. But ultimately, those are the two ways I think you could frame it if you're those people in his orbit. And both lead to, you cannot continue to do this job. And the American people are not convinced that you can do this job. Because the other, and I'll end with this on this note, one of the main issues Democrats had in 2024 was we kept telling people the economy was good, but they did not believe it. Even if on paper it is good, they did not feel that the economy is good. You cannot convince Americans that a president is capable of serving if the only time they see him on TV is when he's tripping up stairs or making gaffes on TV and losing his train of thought in the middle of a debate. That your job, first and foremost as president, is to convince people of your mission and your goal and your platform, and he could not do that. So that alone renders him not effective enough to be president again. And that's what his staff should have had in the back of their minds as well when they were considering, what do we do about this perception issue and this cognitive decline issue that he had.
John, I have a question for you to start off with, which is, a lot of times in politics or in life, the ends justify the means. And in some ways, I think part of the reason the Democrats got here was because of a term we've come to call Trump derangement syndrome, of where people hate Trump in such a way that it justifies certain things. And a part of me in reading this book wonders if the Democrats allowing themselves to look at Trump in such a way that it almost justified what they're doing. And it almost, because the threat that they perceived of Donald Trump taking the White House was so extreme. I want to separate people that, voted, the people that voted against Trump, and there's a variety of people that voted against Trump. But I wonder if they got caught up in the concern so much that in essence justified them propping someone up who I think is clear from this book could not cognitively and physically serve and occupy the presidency for 4 more years.
I think that certainly they got high on their own supply of the rhetoric that they were using about the president and the threats that he supposedly poses to the American people and to our institutions. But the thing that I come back to is they became everything that they accused Donald Trump of being. There was a coup, and it was Joe Biden's staff making decisions on his behalf. Who was the president during those 4 years? That's an important question that's going to need to be answered, right? You see it on all sorts of these things, but if he wasn't in a position to make these decisions, and it was really this group of advisors who was doing the job, that is absolutely a coup. You have people who were not elected running the country. When you talk about threats to democracy, the way that the DNC went and essentially rigged the primary to the point of keeping Dean Phillips off the ballot in Wisconsin. Who was the real threat to democracy? When it came down to it, they did everything that they accused the Trump campaign and President Trump of doing. And I think that they should take a look in the mirror, right? But no, I don't believe that the ends justify the mean. I believe that a lot of these concerns about President Trump have been overblown. But these are the same people who have been referring to every Republican as a Nazi for the last 80 years. And at a certain point, that catches up with you, right? On the topic of Joe Biden was out talking about Mitt Romney in 2012 and said to a room full of African-American voters, I think it was the NAACP conference, that Mitt Romney is going to put y'all back in chains, right? The idea that, this extreme rhetoric that we've become so accustomed to was somehow a new phenomena. I'm sure that they convinced themselves that this was a situation that the ends justify the means, but in the history books, I don't think that it'll be reflected in that way.
Julius, your response.
I mean, I will say I'll push back a little bit on that solely because I think that what we were afraid Donald Trump would become is exactly what we thought he would be and what we said he would become. I think, I not getting too far from the book, the way he's conducted himself in terms of due process and ignoring the courts, that's what we were afraid of. But to come back to the book, the difference is the solution was not to continue running a guy that could not win. The solution was to say, like John said, open up primaries. And by the way, Dean Phillips won in Wisconsin at the Wisconsin Supreme Court to get on the ballot because, like John said, it's democracy. If you're so convinced that that Joe Biden was able to serve another 4 years, why the hell would you not put him on a debate stage and make him stronger? People were already scared about his cognitive ability and his ability to do the job. Why would you not reassure them by putting him up against another Democrat? And I will say this, when Dean Phillips announced and why he announced he was running, I supported. early on because I knew that he was right, that Biden could not do this job. And by the way, and here's what even makes me more sick to my stomach. Now you got me a little amped up about this. Jamie Harrison, who was the DNC chair at the time, who was trying to actively rig these primaries that they were like, Joe Biden's going to win anyways, is still on TV saying that he thinks Biden is okay. That is why we lost. Because our ability to connect with people on the level and where they're at as voters is not clicking. So, I hate giving wins to Republicans sometimes, but like, it's true. The way Biden conducted himself with Merrick Garland and the DOJ related to his son Hunter that they talk about in the book is hypocritical. Because we were saying about Trump that he was politicizing the DOJ. You know what I give Republicans credit for, and I'll finish this thought with this. Republicans had a primary, and guess what? They're winning their candidate that won and didn't even participate in debates because he didn't think he had to, not because there wasn't good competition. He was already leading. If Joe Biden was that good, he should have ran in the primary. And ultimately, the DNC and every Democratic member that went against Dean Phillips owes that man an apology because he was right, and he pointed out that if we do not have a primary, we are going to lose because we have to put Joe Biden to the test. And they didn't. And I think that's right. Like, I don't know that some of the things he said about rhetoric are true because I think what we were concerned about is happening. But I think when you say something about the way Trump and Republicans are conducting themselves and then you do the same thing, then you don't have any moral ground to stand on after that, specifically related to Biden only in his administration.
Let's pivot to Dean Phillips for a second, who, as John was the first to tell me, got his own chapter in the book, and then I read it. A couple things about Dean Phillips. Had the opportunity, he's been on this podcast before when he ran for president. Becky and I interviewed him. He and I, a few years ago, did a bipartisan log rolling at the state fairgrounds, which was a gas to do. Dean Phillips, someone once told me that they were paraphrasing a quote that not attributed to them, but I'm just going to repeat, which is, it's tough to be a prophet in your own land. And Dean Phillips said a lot of things that turned out to be true. And one of the things I find so fascinating is how right Dean Phillips was and how much the entire machine of the Democratic Party and some in the media just hammered him left and right for what he was saying. And I think a lot of people's take, both nationally and locally, is to say, Dean Phillips is owed an apology. Julius, your perspective on Dean Phillips. Oh, let me also just disclose for a second. We were discussing the Dean Phillips. I had said on my podcast in summer of last year that I had said to Becky, I said, look, I know who I'm voting for, and I'll disclose it at a later time. Then that pivoted. I changed, and I decided to be a Republican for Harris, and then eventually a Republican for Harris and Walz. But I disclosed that I was planning on writing in Liz Cheney for president and Dean Phillips for vice president. That was going to be my vote. But some dynamics changed, and I decided to pivot on that. But Dean Phillips is someone who I thought, and John, you were on for a number of these episodes, we talked about the thoughtfulness of Dean Phillips and what he was messaging and what he was talking about. And again, one of the takeaways from this book is, aside from getting his own chapter, Dean Phillips was right. And Julius, you've commented about that on social media. How big of an apology is Dean Phillips owed?
Yeah, I'll say this, and I'm a little biased again, but I supported him when he ran for president simply because his message was right, because what he was saying was true. The DNC and every Democratic leader in Congress that railed against him should publicly apologize that they were not only a part of a cover-up, but that they still to this day degrade a man who was 100% right about everything he said about this election. There was not a single thing that Dean Phillips said in the course of primarying Joe Biden and before and after that hasn't become true. He said the polls said that Joe Biden could not win. The polls said that, and it was true. Joe Biden said, Dean Phillips said, if we do not have a robust primary, we are going to end up losing. We didn't have a robust primary, and we lost. So ultimately, I think Dean Phillips is, and you know what I love about him, and I will say this, he's not going on a like I told you so tour. He's still like humble about the truth and the fact that he was right about this. So ultimately, I think what I even think is still so crazy is like a lot of these media pundits and a lot of these people who are railing against Dean Phillips for trying to primary Joe Biden and trying to point out the obvious still will go on TV and be smug about it and not address the fact that they were wrong. Like they'll make a little quip, oh, he wasn't serious. He was more correct than you were, and you get paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to talk about this and do this. So I think ultimately Dean Phillips will go down in history as the only courageous person to step up and say something before public pressure came out. Because there's a lot of Democrats that called for Biden to step down after the debate. And Dean Phillips, months before, stood up and said, we are headed in the wrong direction and we are going to lose. And he got ridiculed and ultimately lost his seat and his leadership position because of it. And I think Democrats really need to do some soul searching about that. It makes me sick to my stomach. It does that he was treated that way. And still to this day, people won't acknowledge that was the truth. And that he was right.
John, have the Democrats what should the Democrats' approach and response be to Dean Phillips? Will he ever get the necessary apology that he's owed and respect for taking out that brave position that he did?
No, and I think people like us will remember his name, but I think he's a minor player in this chapter in the grand scheme of things. Good credit to him. He tried to raise the alarm bell. This is something that other people saw coming as well, but he was willing to put his name behind it. I think he is owed an apology, but I don't think that he'll get one just because at the end of the day, I think people are out there focused on kind of the revisionist history of this, and I think need to do some soul searching about what the path forward for the party is. And really, I think more importantly for our country is to get a full accounting of what it was that happened. And I am optimistic that Republicans in Congress will work on getting to the bottom of this. I'm hopeful that we'll get some congressional hearings, but there absolutely needs to be a more detailed accounting of this than this book. And I talked about how many people were granted anonymity, up to and including cabinet secretaries. And we need to get names on the record. We need to go through just how deep this went and what an absolute scandal this was for our country in order for us to be able to move on from it, start rebuilding that trust.
Let's dial down on that for a second and take things a little bit in reverse order. One of the things I wanted to discuss today was I think that there is a need for a 9/11 type hearing on a 9/11 type commission or hearing about what occurred here in during Biden's term, through those final couple of years, because I think everything failed in a very serious way. And that I think that we as a country and as the institution of the presidency need to have a full accounting of what was done. So I echo what you're saying, John, and agree with you immensely, because there are serious questions. I think about Scott Jennings on CNN, who repeatedly has said, if Joe Biden isn't capable to run, who's running the country right now? That's a fair question. My concern, I had seen and had documented pretty aggressive, consistently, as did Becky, the kind of cognitive decline that we were seeing and how there was a group of double haters or people who didn't like Trump, didn't like Biden, and they were frustrated with the choices. But it's very clear that let me say it this way. Everybody spins in politics. There's an element of spinning, but spinning can only go so far. And when you spin to the point of gaslighting and being disingenuous, this was a very elaborate scheme that went on here that involved not only members of the media, which we'll get to, but what I want to focus on for just a second for this next few minutes is the people that worked for the bureaucracy, the people that worked in the office of the presidency and in the executive branch and in the institution of government, and those potentially in Congress too, that allowed this scheme to perpetuate. I think that's why I think this is more serious than Watergate, because I think it was incredibly elaborate what was done. And I think the American public deserves more transparency going forward. What's your take on the level of information that should come out? Should there be congressional hearings? Should there be a commission? Should the Democrats, what role will the Democrats play in that? Should they play? Because I legitimately, as someone who wants to see government function better, and as someone who wants there to be a vibrant two-party system, I think that this is a bipartisan problem that I hope doesn't get pushed aside as just one side being critical of the other. I think this type of situation warrants there being a bipartisan examination. John, I'll start with you. Your take, and then we'll go to Julius.
Oh, I think there absolutely needs to be, at the very minimum, congressional hearings. But yeah, would gladly see a commission or a report come out. And my hope would be that the Democrats are able to put their own prejudices aside and come to the table and participate in this, because I think that this is a really important thing for the country. And I'm going to continue separating the government side and the bureaucracy side from the media side, because I do think that there needs to be a reckoning within the media as well on this.
Yep, we'll talk about
how willing they were to go along with what was fed to them by the Biden administration, how willing they were to carry water. The media's job is to be curious. The media's job is to investigate and to tell the truth. And I think we have all been in places where we have seen people lie to the press before. It's not necessarily a new thing for somebody to try and spin the press or mislead the press or make excuses. But if the lesson here is that if you just lie to the press enough, they'll listen to it and attack your opponent, that's a really dangerous lesson to learn. And I think that there's some important lessons that Republicans should learn, the media should learn, and Democrats should learn throughout this entire episode. But yeah, we absolutely need to get to the bottom of the actual questions of who was governing, who was involved with this cover-up, and go through that process. But I think that there's some additional work that needs to be done beyond that to answer some of those other questions as well.
Julius, hearings, congressional, bipartisan, commission. We'll get to media in a second, but what do you think should be done to shed some light on what the bureaucracy did?
Yeah, I don't know that, this is probably where I disagree. I don't know that we need to spend potentially millions of taxpayer dollars on an investigation to something we know about, in the sense of, maybe if you want to ask that, I don't know that it makes sense. For me, it seems like a waste of time. It seems like a waste of resources in terms of congressional hearings. I think also, I don't know that I would potentially be interested in giving any more politicized commissions breath going into the midterms. And ultimately, just from a political perspective, I don't know that you're going to get a lot of Democrats, so that doesn't really shore up the validity of it anyways. Here's what I do think, though, is that there are a lot of things Congress can do with its ability to instill new laws and create new oversight so that this doesn't happen again, right? So there should be some sort of law that says if you are the current president, you need to take a cognitive test every year. Your medical reports in detail from an independent doctor, not from a doctor of your choosing at the White House. I think you should have to do that. I think your medical reports should be fairly non-politicized. I think there's a lot of things you can do related to this. I don't want to sound ageist. That's what I'm going to get called probably, but I think you should be under a certain age to be president. And once you're a certain age, you should not be allowed to run for office. I think that's another thing, right? Because ultimately, again, this comes down to, can you convince people that you can do the job? Some people can at that age, but we don't want to give Americans reasons to be unsure about the presidency, right? But again, I will say this. I don't know that congressional hearings and millions of taxpayer dollars to a very politicized commission is going to make a ton of sense. But I think there's guardrails in place that you can put to prevent this from happening again. Ultimately, this comes down to, in my opinion, there was a small group of people that chose to lie to Americans, and the president, whether he has cognitive decline or not, however you view it, was unable to continue past his most recent term doing that job. What I will say is, what I believe about this is, I don't think he could have done the job for 4 more years, but I think he finished out and was probably semi-fine. But it's a tough situation to be in, because I just don't think that taxpayer dollars for this is going to make much of a difference ultimately for what already happened. Yep.
Something that I think is dangerous in the reading of this and the way that it's been covered and the way that people are looking back is that looking at it as this small group of people who did this, because it might have been a small number of masterminds who were orchestrating the cover-up, but there was a massive amount of infrastructure and investment and people behind perpetuating the cover-up and going along with it. And I think that's a very important component of this as well. How people were fooled into this and how willingly they went along with it, I think is a really important component of this, because certainly you have to hold the people at the top accountable, but you also had a lot of people who were willingly going along with it, who weren't asking questions, who weren't intellectually curious, who were lying to themselves as well. And I think it's really important that we don't let people off the hook who went along with this when they should have known better and when the American people knew better.
And if I could push back a little bit, because I think what you're saying is correct in sentiment, and I don't disagree entirely, but what I do think we learned from the book is a lot of people did ask questions. They were just too cowardly to come up and to say something about their concerns, right? There was a lot
of... That's an important piece of this, isn't it? If we're trying to take lessons learned from this, isn't that an important part of the story to get to the bottom of, beyond just placing the blame at the foot of the Politburo and those senior staffers and close friends? Because certainly there was an entire infrastructure that was built around keeping this secret that included people willingly going along with this.
For sure. And that's what I think where I'm coming from is just, I think that I don't know that we need to spend millions of taxpayer dollars on congressional hearings for that. The voters ultimately will hold accountable. Yeah, I think Jake Tapper and Alex Thompson should tell names. I think that maybe that's a good idea, so that these, like you said, cabinet secretaries and members of Congress who were concerned and asked questions and still concerned after didn't raise those concerns should be held accountable by people. I think they should be held accountable by voters. And I think ultimately what frustrates me the most about this, and I'll end with this, is just that there were a lot of people asking questions that were concerned like we were. There wasn't a lot of people who had the courage and integrity to share those concerns, even if it wasn't making a definitive statement. You don't have to say to someone in the media, I think Joe Biden has cognitive decline. What you can say is, listen, I asked questions to the White House, they didn't answer, and that makes me concerned. And that's ultimately, that comes down to having personal integrity. That's why I respect Dean Phillips, because he wasn't saying Joe Biden has cognitive decline. He was saying the American people don't trust him to do the job. And that's concerning to me. And so I get what you're saying, but I don't know that it's like this. And I don't even know if I agree with Michael that it's this Watergate level thing, except for the fact that it was just a small group of people covering it up and lying. Because ultimately, this is where I end the question with, and I've been struggling with since reading the book, is how do you hold people accountable for trying to get that information, but being stopped by the ones who knew it? I can ask you a million times over if Joe Biden's mentally okay. And if you tell me yes a million times, I can still have questions, but I have nothing to go off of. I have no credible source to say, as a reporter, this is what people are saying, this is what the White House says. I don't know if that makes sense, but
I would say this, as someone who's read a lot about Watergate, I think the number of people involved in this is exponentially greater than there was in Watergate. And that, let me say this, Watergate led to a number of substantive reforms in government. That's because there was accountability through hearings and reporting about where the problems were. What we have right now is we have a book that the New York Times is called Explosive. Politico are just reading about it, and it's become a focus of this podcast episode. But ultimately, I think for there to be any teeth and any true accounting for what happens, I think there needs to be more done. Because if we truly want to prevent government from functioning and going in this situation again, Julius, I don't want to be argumentative or push back on you too much, but your argument is it's a small group. But then if it's a small group, they got away with this. And to John's point, who I identify more with in this context, it was a larger group. And if we don't know exactly what has happened, and we can't put the safeguards in place, look at all of the governmental reforms, the campaign finance reforms, and the structural reforms that came from our government in the aftermath of Watergate. There needs to be that level of accounting, because I do agree with you, Julius, that there was a small group, but that small group, I think, impacted a larger group, which allowed this to happen. And I think one of my concerns about this, which dovetails into, I think, the final subject on this I want to discuss, which is the media, is where we are getting the most explosive version of events is from the media. And it was, I think, the institution that suffered the most, aside from the American public, but probably long term, that has the most damage, is the media in how they reported on this. The level of gaslighting, the level of pushback, the amount of institutional bias that every person was presented, I think is profound. And I think it is, I think if there's anyone who needs to digest and learn what happens, it's the media. One of the byproducts, I think, of a larger commission or something more august, other than something that could just be labeled as partisan, is because the public, the American public, can see how much of a failure the media did. And I will say to you that the media loves to not be the story, while also simultaneously always making the story about themselves. And I'm someone who's been has shied away from ever engaging in a lot of media conspiracy, media bias. We've had reporters and journalists on this podcast, and we all interface them in some ways. But I think if you were a reporter in Washington, D.C., or covering the presidential race, and you didn't get this out, you need to do some very serious look in the mirror, a serious review in the mirror about your observation skills. And if your biases and your failure to see what was going on led you to not report on, I think, one of the largest cover-ups and schemes, larger than Watergate, probably in American history. John, you've been talking a lot about the media's role. Take this time and give your perspective to our listeners about the media failure and what potentially you think reforms, what they will see, or will the media do a better job because of this?
I will say that I also try to not get into the back and forth of arguing that the media is biased against Republicans or for Democrats. That being said, at a national level within the political reporter world, over the last, I will say, 6 or 7 years, I think that we have seen less curiosity and more of a willingness to accept what the Democrats are saying at face value. And I don't think that's a healthy place for our media to be. When in 2020, when Hunter Biden's laptop showed up, which we now know to have belonged to Hunter Biden and to have been used in his criminal trial, National Public Radio put out a statement, their editor put out a statement saying, we don't cover gossip. It's not real. It's Russian disinformation. When there were legitimate questions about Biden Inc., this was a right-wing conspiracy theory. When people raised concerns about President Biden's cognitive decline and his ability to do his job, even including Laura Trump, Jake Tapper attacked her and said, this is ridiculous. We're not going to talk about this. We're not engaging in conspiracy theories. I think that the media needs to take a look at what makes it to the point where they were so willing to go along with that. And it's not just once, it's not twice. There's a track record of this. And I don't know if it was a ends justify the means type thing, if it was a Biden gets more leeway because he had that long reputation of being a good guy, of not being like other politicians, or what it is. But my hope is that this will present the media an opportunity to click the reset button and to go back to being curious, to go back to investigating. There were a handful of reporters who tried to cover this story and did so at expense of access to themselves. They were removed from White House briefings. Their calls weren't returned. They were blacklisted by the White House. The amount of coverage that retribution got compared to something like the Secretary of Defense removing the AP's desk from inside the Pentagon. There was no loss of saying you can't cover it. It was just, you're not going to have a desk. The amount of coverage that got compared to reporters, their friends in the press corps, being blacklisted because they dared question whether or not Joe Biden was up to the job, is a astounding difference. Whether it would look at the amount of coverage that there is about people, where we have Donald Trump, who is among the most accessible presidents in history. I think I saw a stat today that 90% of days he has done media since he's been in office. Just the absolute difference in the way that the media looks at that compared to how their colleagues were treated is really telling. So I'm hopeful that they'll be able to reset. I don't know what that'll look like, but unfortunately, I think we saw some of the same lack of curiosity with Kamala Harris's campaign when she was there, and the way that was covered compared to the way that President Trump was covered or Vice President Vance was covered. Yeah, I think this presents the media an opportunity to maybe take a look at where are they hiring, what are the skill sets that they're doing, how have they tweaked their coverage to match what their consumers are buying. I think that certainly that's a consideration that I think has had an impact on the way that things are covered as people are in this era of chasing clicks. You can either go the Atlantic side of things and you can build a very insular readership that wants to subscribe and wants to hear a certain version of the news, or Fox does on TV, or MSNBC does, and you start to get into these little silos. Or you can go the other route, and I think this is a incredible opportunity for an independent media. I think Mark Halperin was one of the best, most impactful reporters in the 2024 cycle, who was consistently well-sourced, who consistently told stories that nobody else was. And I think he's building a really interesting world. Same with Chris Cillizza, who, former Washington Post guy, former CNN guy. Tara Palmieri is now out on her own. And I think an independent media is a really interesting opportunity that kind of arises from this, where individual reporters have the opportunity to build their own brands, build their own credibility. And I think that there's going to be a desire from particularly sophisticated consumers of the news to follow those reporters in a way where I think it'll be really interesting to see how they build their individual brands rather than following a news outlet, and reporters will become trusted on their own.
Julius, your take on the media's role in this story, and what will they learn from this?
Yeah, I particularly do enjoy wearing my partisan hat, so I'm going to do it here. I think the tumultuous relationship with media and how they cover things has changed on both sides of the aisle related to how people will say CNN is obviously a left-leaning news source. Fox News is a right-leaning news source. There's one of those that is paying $800 million in a lawsuit for lying to the American people, right? So if you want to say that, hey, this mainstream media news source should be more diligent on these stories, I agree with that. And this goes back to my other points of saying, if you don't have a credible story to run with, you can't run with it. They were blocked at every step of the way, as we read in the book, from reporting on Biden's health. That they didn't have any sources that would come out and be honest with them about where he was cognitively, and not in a way that was credible to their story about it if they were thinking about writing a story. And so that's where I struggle a little bit, is I don't want reporters going out and saying, this is what we're hearing, and have no sources to back it up. Because of course I'm not going to trust that, because there's nothing behind it besides some rumors. What I will also say is that if your claim is that this was some sort of cover-up by the media, I don't think that's what it was. I think it was ignorance. I think it was lack of diligence. But it's a game that both sides of the political media, like news, are doing. Again, there's one organization that has a very clear leaning that is paying $800 million lying to the American people, blatantly lying. And if you cannot acknowledge that, and also let me back up too. The tumultuous relationship and the aggressive nature of reporting now and the way that it's conducted in not only the Biden White House, but the Trump White House started when Donald Trump started calling the media fake news. So, of course, everything that comes across and every story that isn't reported on is always going to have a heightened level of scrutiny now more than ever. And I think, John, what you're saying is correct in the sense that maybe there are some people that should be more independent and build their own brands and be willing to talk about the things other people aren't willing to talk about. But I think it's also important to say that if this story couldn't be written because there wasn't, and like we saw in the book, it couldn't be written because there wasn't credible backing behind it, I'm okay with that. Because now Jake Tapper is doing the work of saying, listen, I was wrong because I didn't have the information, but now I do. And he makes it a point, I think, pretty clear that the same people who wouldn't talk to him before the election are willing to talk to him now. And I think that's not a problem of the media not doing their due diligence in the sense of hammering these people. I think it's the people who were doing it that were lying. So again, it comes down to this. For me, there has to be a level of due diligence that I think I agree with you on, John, that they need to push a little bit harder. But if they're locked out at every step, I don't want them just reporting just to report. I want credible news. And that at the time just unfortunately wasn't credible news to them, whatever their decision-making process on that was. But I do appreciate, I'll just say this really quick. Jake Tapper's a bull moose, a member of the Bull Moose Party. That doesn't mean he's not a Democrat, maybe in leaning, but I don't know. I don't know if it holds as much weight because of the way that media has been portrayed in the Trump era. I just think it's there's scrutiny when you do, there's scrutiny when you don't. So how do you go about being credible in your reporting? And that's really, I think, what it came down to, for me, at least.
The thing that I would push back on, and the idea that there was nothing to do because they got lied to, that's what reporting is for, right? You go and you do the research, and you don't just regurgitate what your sources say. There were absolutely reporters out there who were telling this story, right? Whether it was Alex Thompson was writing these stories, right? As early as 2022, the Wall Street Journal was writing these stories. They were having people, and they were attacked because they're a Murdoch-owned entity, and this is the Fox News of newspapers and whatever. But they had reporting, and they were sourced, and they were telling the story. They were then attacked and criticized by the Biden administration. But that doesn't make their reporting not true. It doesn't mean that there was not a story to tell. And I think the larger point is just how willingly people went along with what they were being told by the Biden administration, and just how willing they were to go about it. I think it absolutely should have been news that in response to this reporting by the Wall Street Journal, they were blackballed by the White House.
For sure.
That is absolutely a story.
Right.
And I take issue with the idea that there was not reporting that could be done. And also, I just keep getting back to this. We all saw it with our own eyes, right? Dean Phillips saw it with his own eyes.
Right.
He is out there telling the story. The idea that reporters couldn't simultaneously use their own eyes and report on what we were seeing, the willingness with which they went and said, these are cheap fakes, they had the same opportunity to watch these videos as we all did and say, no, he froze there, he fell there, they have changed the way that they're bringing him to events. There's not stairs anymore. He's using the short stairs. There were all sorts of things. And even going back, God, what was it? Was it 2019 when Joe Biden was at the rally in honor of that congresswoman who had passed away, and he tried to give her a shout out from the stage at a memorial for her? That should have been people's first sign, right? You're at a memorial for a dead congresswoman and you ask if she's there. That's not just a mental slip. That's not just Biden being Biden. And there were numerous examples like that, but they were all dismissed as, well, that's just Joe Biden and he's a nice guy. And isn't Donald Trump just so terrible that we have to do this?
Yeah.
So I think getting to that real story, and I think it's just far too easy to let people off and saying they got lied to, so therefore it's not their fault.
I'll just say really quick too, like really fast. I think what the broader scope of the conversation is too, is that the way that the White House is, from the Trump and Biden and maybe even other administrations, treat media and news outlets when they don't like the stories that they're putting out is another factor that needs to be enabled in there. Because Biden's White House absolutely, when they got bad stories, did whatever they could to stop them and were incredibly disingenuous and not transparent. And that's a precedent that was set by the president before him. And we need to get back to a place where White Houses and reporters cannot just have vendettas against each other, but just report on honest news. So I think I will give you the fact that like Biden and his administration were incredibly hypocritical about how they treated the media and what they said about what Donald Trump was doing when he was treating the media. So I agree with you in that sense for sure.
Let's not get too far. Vendettas are as American as apple pie. So let's not take vendettas off the table. I will say to you just to close this out is I think this is the biggest media screw up since nobody at the Daily Planet could figure out that Clark Kent was Superman. I think that's how big of a screw up it was. It's that obvious. And I think the one thing I'll just say is, and feel free to respond or we can close it down, is I think the media is the most, look, the voters can voice their displeasure at the Democratic Party, members of Congress, they can hold people accountable. They can be mad at a variety of people, and they can show that by voting. One of the least difficult institutions to hold accountable is the media in some ways, because they're independent. They self-govern, and they don't answer to the voters. They answer to their bottom line, and that type of autonomy makes it very difficult to hold them, because we want there to be an independent media, because we want there to be a freedom of the press. But make no mistake about it, I think the institution that comes out the worst in this book is the media. And my concern, and feel free to push back in closing here, but my concern is that they are the least able to hold accountable, because they don't answer to us. They answer to their subscribers and to their companies. We don't have a direct way as voters to hold them accountable. Guys, I want to thank you so much for doing this today and doing our first book review. I think it's pretty clear because we dedicated an hour of the show, we'd recommend that people go buy this book.
Yeah.
But I want to thank you both for offering unique perspectives. We agreed a lot. We disagreed on some, but I just really appreciate you guys coming on and sharing your thoughts about this important book, one of the most important books that I've read in recent time. And I think it's a political discussion and a scandal that we're going to be talking about for a very long time. So thank you guys both.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thanks, Michael.
I want to thank you for listening to this episode of The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky. We know you have a lot of podcast options out there, and we're truly grateful you chose to spend time with us. Before you go, show some love for your favorite podcast by leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. You can also follow us across our website and all social media platforms at BBBreakPod. The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky will return next week. Until then, thank you for tuning in. We appreciate you flying with us through the world of politics and current affairs. Have a great week.